Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning from Berlin, Germany. We're starting the 300th broadcast of Demolishing Myths talks. Thank you very much for joining us, and remember to give us a thumbs up. 300 talks. And to celebrate this occasion, we're joined today by Mr. Fernando Moragón and Mr. Juan Antonio Aguilar. Fernando, Juan Antonio, how's everything going over there?
Fernando, Juan Antonio, ¿qué tal todo por ahí?
Muy bien.
Very well. Okay, fine. I'm already getting ready to go underground. I mean, I cover myself like this and no one can recognize me.
300 broadcasts that crime has sent us.
Exactly. I'm loaded. I don't know about you guys, but I've got a killer bank account.
With so much money received, he's already under investigation by the banking system for sponsoring drug trafficking and terrorism, right? Terrorism. What a bunch of shameless people.
No, it's not the CIA or anything like that. It's because of Antonio, the one who sponsors terrorism.
How's your voice? Better than last time, right?
Better, getting over the pharyngitis. This has already become a tradition for me, like Christmas. I mean, December comes and boom, pharyngitis.
Comrades. Well, first I want to start by thanking you for joining us here on Demolishing Myths. From this humble place, we create a space for critical analysis. More and more people are joining us. A lot of credit goes to all of us, and especially to you. So 1,000 thanks for taking part in this. That's first. Secondly, perhaps an announcement. Next year we won't be starting on DMP, our sister channel. We're going to stop broadcasting on DMP, but Fernando and Juan Antonio will be doing their broadcasts, their shows here, on Demolishing Myths. So, well, they'll be joining us just as they have until now. And having said that, for today, dear Fernando and dear Juan Antonio, I basically wanted the following. First, to present a bit of the current situation, and then to answer questions from the main star of tonight, of this broadcast basically, or from the real stars, the demolishers, the audience that's always there, standing firm, accompanying us. The questions have already started coming in. I'll be collecting them throughout the broadcast, and you all, or all of us, can answer them. Maybe Fernando, the first one for you. Putin in India, 2 or 3 days of an official visit. What is the significance of this visit by the Russian president to India, dear Fernando?
Well, look, an even stronger reinforcement, if that's possible, of the relationship between India and Russia with Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, which is key, which is vital. In fact, in those images of Putin's arrival, the Prime Minister himself appeared unexpectedly because protocol doesn't require it, and you can see him there, all smiles, giving Putin a hug. In other words, showing, because these gestures are deliberate, that the alliance, or whatever we want to call it, the cooperation between India and Russia is extremely close. Agreements are already being signed in the military sphere, for example, and of course in the energy sector. For India, Russia is essential from an energy standpoint, and this is what the White House in Washington didn't seem to understand and still doesn't seem to fully grasp. Tariff-based and other kinds of blackmail or pressure might work with small countries, but with India, not so much. And that's where we are, strengthening an alliance that's strategic for both sides. Moreover, Putin is, let's say, an excellent intermediary between the two major Asian powers, China and India, since he has privileged relations with both. So those occasional tensions between Indians and Chinese, well, Putin acts there as a kind of calming influence. So, well, you just have to look at the images. Red carpet, the whole thing. And I suppose that at the end of the visit, they'll make the relevant statements about the energy, military, and all kinds of agreements being signed.
All right, should I add something? Yes, go ahead. Draw the viewer's attention so they notice what a properly prepared meeting looks like, as it should be, and what some people think can be improvised. That's why the famous meeting that was supposed to take place between Trump and Putin in Budapest had to be canceled. Why? Because you come to these things with the work already done. In other words, what we're really seeing in this visit are the protocol aspects and the gestures, which are very important, but they're just gestures, because the real work has already been done. That is, the pile of agreements that have already been signed obviously didn't happen because Modi and Putin sat down at a table and started signing as they went along. Of course, this is already done, which is what happens when things are done seriously, right? And not like how people in the West lately think they should be done. A kind of permanent improvisation, a lack of seriousness and rigor. And well, along with everything that's already been said, some of the agreements are more or less known. Some are of a strategic nature, very important ones. But ultimately, and to support what Fernando said, this is really a material expression of the Primakov Doctrine, that famous Russia-China-India triad, which would now be expanded with an additional leg in Iran, but which is fundamental for maintaining control over all of Eurasia and preventing external powers from somehow taking advantage of resources or destabilizing the region. I think in that sense, it's a very important trip like the one Putin recently made to China. That's the level we're talking about. Lately, the state visits of presidents are inversely proportional to the attention they get from the European press, especially the Spanish press. The more important they are, the less attention they receive, because obviously there are much, much more important topics. And before the show started, we were talking about one of them, right? Like the FIFA Peace Award, right?
Indeed, we're going to present it soon. But what are the agreements signed between Putin and Modi, or some of them? Because there were some very important things being mentioned regarding defense. Fernando or Juan Antonio, whoever wants to answer.
Fernando, Juan Antonio, quien quiera.
Well, basically, I think they were negotiating aside from the purchase of the Su-57, that is, the export version, obviously. But anyway, there was even talk about selling not the S-400, since they already sold that one. How many more are you going to buy? The S-500. That's a whole different level.
Of course, between Russia and India, it's not just about buying or selling weapons. There's also collaboration in developing some of the systems. For example, the Onyx anti-ship missile is the Indian BrahMos, right? That is, India was already involved in the Su-57 project from the start. But anyway, just to mention one I heard about, Russia is going to lease a nuclear submarine to India for $2 billion. And there was talk of leasing some Tupolev 160 aircraft, the famous White Swan, which is a strategic bomber capable of carrying nuclear missiles. India is a nuclear power. So this is just to say, but I think what really stands out here is the issue of long-term projection. And one important thing, agreements so that India can also use the northern route. Of course, that route that is so valuable to China, the one that allows products to pass through the Arctic and move toward Europe and North America. India is also interested in having its products, instead of traveling all across the Indian Ocean, possibly through the Middle East, around Africa, and so on, head north and from there use the northern maritime routes. There have also been agreements on that, beyond, of course, the issue of purchasing Russian fossil fuels. And another very, very important aspect, because what's being discussed is nothing less than a free trade agreement between Russia and India, which would be conducted in national currencies for 90% of transactions. The remaining 10% would be in Emirati currencies or in dollars, since those are part of both countries' reserves, but national currencies would be used primarily. In other words, the process of deglobalization, gradual but ongoing, continues.
Yes. Moreover, expanding on what Juan Antonio says, look, the fact that you lease them a nuclear-powered submarine and a Tu-160, the White Swan, this means you lease them out, but since India is a nuclear power, whatever they put in there afterward is India's business.
What's the purpose of renting this material? What's behind this rental idea?
This only makes sense. I mean, when a country's armed forces lease equipment, it only makes sense for that lease to last while similar weapon systems are being built or purchased outright. For example, leasing a nuclear submarine happens because the Indian Armed Forces General Staff has in mind to build or buy or have one built in Russia, in Russian shipyards, a nuclear submarine that is properly Indian. So that interval, which could be 2, 3, or 4 years depending on the type of project, is when, well, you lease one. But of course, what you're doing is, moreover, even the rental price itself would probably be deducted from the purchase price of the submarine if the final purchase goes through. In other words, it's a business. From where? Just imagine what it means to sell strategic bombers or nuclear submarines. Remember the incident, the fit France threw when the 6 nuclear submarines that Australia was going to build or buy were snatched away by the United States, because we're talking about many, many billions of dollars. Yes, exactly. That's the point. The point is that, at some point, if it hasn't already been discussed, they're going to move forward with the purchase or acquisition or request that their own nuclear submarine be built. And in the meantime, they have one on lease. That happened in Spain, for example, with the Leopard tanks, the German Leopard battle tanks. That is, for a while, they were leased, those same ones that were later sent as scrap to Ukraine, the Leopard 2A4s, while the factory that was going to produce the Leopards was being built, and in the meantime, those were leased.
If I remember correctly, India has already begun building 2 nuclear submarines, in addition to its somewhat older fleet. But there are 2 new submarines under construction, and one about to begin commissioning, the assignment, which will also help train the sailors in charge of that submarine naturally, right?
And besides, it's not just about building the submarine. You have to train the crew. A nuclear submarine doesn't operate the same way as one powered by diesel and electric batteries. So you have to train and prepare the crew. And logically, since we've already seen that India had a conflict with Pakistan, as always, the usual conflicts, a power that wants to have real weight across Eurasia knows it must develop a significant and credible deterrent force, and that's why those nuclear submarines are necessary. So, of course, while you finish, because this isn't something you can build in a month, constructing a series of submarines you've already ordered, 1, 2, or probably more in the future, what you do to start training and building capability is rent one. Now, a nuclear submarine isn't something you just rent casually. That is, Russia can rent one. China doesn't need to because it already has its own developed, but it could rent one to a very trusted ally. Because logically, there are sensitive systems involved. It's a very trusted ally, and in this case, it's India. If anyone ever had the illusion that India could be turned against Russia, they can forget about it, because that's not how things are going to go.
And besides, there's an endemic problem when it comes to weaponry, to Indian armament, and that's its absolute diversity. I mean, they have 14 different types of fighter jets, French, American, Russian. In the end, they're going to have to start standardizing, to some extent, that whole zoo of weaponry, which has always been one of the Indian Army's problems. They have too much diversity, let's say, in their weapons systems.
And in any army. The thing is, many times your contracts are made, commercial contracts that are done because they have to be, in order to secure other contracts that maybe have nothing to do with defense. They're industrial, technological, or other types of contracts, right? Or for importing and exporting raw materials or whatever. So of course, many times you end up being forced to buy a series of planes that are completely different from the ones you already have, right? And in the end, you have a Frankenstein fleet, right? Yes. Each with its own systems, its own software, each one. Anyway, it's complicated, but clearly that happens because, well, in the end, that's happened in Spain too, right? You have to buy a series of weapons systems because it's a condition they impose for signing all kinds of contracts that maybe have nothing to do with defense.
And also, many times, for example, in Spain's case, it's very difficult to say no to the United States when it comes to buying weapons, for instance.
Let's wrap up the Indian issue here, because we want to answer questions, but as a transition, nothing more and nothing less than this.
Today, this moves me.
A beautiful medal. Señor Presidente, este es su premio.
Mr. President, this is your award. There's also a beautiful medal for you. You can wear it wherever you go.
Excellent. This is what matters. The rest is nonsense. Let's see, and how pleased Uncle Donald is.
Really happy, like a child. The degree of naivety.
That's what he likes. Getting awards on that great stage they have there. It's the show, he's a showman. That's what he enjoys.
Gianni Infantino, whom Trump called Choni instead of Gianni, is now going to present the award. On behalf of the billions of soccer players, we present the FIFA Peace Award every year.
Lie, because this is the first time.
Distinguished individual who exemplifies an
We award it to a distinguished individual who exemplifies a commitment to peace in the world.
leadership and action. And therefore, FIFA, the Fédération Internationale de Football Association,
And that's why FIFA is giving the FIFA Peace Award to, it's giving this award to Donald Trump in recognition of his exceptional actions to promote peace in the world. It must be said, Ezequiel. Yes, Juan Antonio, go ahead.
Sí, Juan Antonio, adelante.
It must be said that this is clearly an award that was created specifically to, without a doubt, surely with the intention of pleasing him for not receiving the Peace Prize, and surely also in exchange for some handouts, because FIFA is one of the most corrupt, most mafia-like international associations in the world, and with the most money. Yes. Besides, it's in competition with UEFA. It's not clear which of the two is really more deceitful, corrupt, and shameless, right? So, well, I imagine it didn't take much effort for the high-ranking officials at the White House to fill out the check for FIFA. so that the award could be created and given to Donald Trump. Hey, that way Uncle Donald is happy too.
Of course. Let's see what. Juan Antonio, there's something that never ceases to amaze me. After the 20th century, such a turbulent one, I mean, the current level of pretense, I honestly couldn't care less about reality anymore. I make up an award. We already know that Trump has won, that he's pacified 7 or 8 wars during his term. I've lost count. I mean, they just don't care about making fools of themselves. Any reasonably informed person, you don't have to be an expert in geopolitics or anything, as you were saying, realizes it and says this is a joke. I mean, this is ridiculous.
But that's the filth of the spectacle. Of course. In the 60s, well, no, sorry, many analysts, philosophers, and social thinkers have been analyzing it. We live in a society where everything is appearance. There's no substance. It has no substance at all. This guy is about to set the entire Caribbean on fire. How can he be given a peace prize? This is simply putting on a show so that a person with a huge ego, a narcissist like Donald Trump, can feel happy, comfortable, and so on. And hey, if the mafia-like organization also gets a check for making that gesture toward the president, well, fine, right? I mean, everyone wins. Everyone wins. Here, Trump's words of gratitude.
And beyond awards, Johnny and I were discussing this.
This is one of the greatest honors of my life. And behind the scenes, we were talking with Johnny, instead of Channy, saying that we saved millions and millions of lives.
So as an example, over 10 million people killed, and it was heading for another 10 million very quickly.
And more millions.
An example is the war in Africa, the war in the Congo, where 10 million lives had been lost, and we saved another 10 million, like the war between India and Pakistan, something denied by both the Indians and the Pakistanis. But what wickedness. He saved 100 million lives. How evil. And in some cases, we prevent wars before they even start. I've known Johnny for such a long time.
You set new records on ticket sales, and not
And we sold a ton of tickets. Well, a bit more of this strange, very modern mix of geopolitical collapse and decadent spectacle.
Televised corruption. I mean, Juan Antonio was telling me exchange of favors. And above all, look, some of the things he says. Well, the first thing is that I think Trump, although he's hyper-narcissistic, when he says things like he's ended 14 wars, that he's prevented the deaths of billions of human beings and so on, he doesn't believe it. He's putting on a theatrical performance. But something he mentioned is actually interesting. We haven't ended the war in the Congo. They haven't ended the war in the Congo. What they've done is sign an agreement with the Congolese government for the exploitation of many mineral resources by American companies that they have done.
But come on, I think the award Donald Trump deserves, and I mean this seriously, is in the yes, 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 exactly.
No doubt he deserves it for the best performance of a lifetime.
They should give it to him.
It's only fair.
Well, besides all that fanfare, the draw was also held during that same celebration, at that same event, for the World Cup groups. This is the first World Cup with 3 host countries, the United States, Claudia Sheinbaum, and the President of Canada, whose name slipped my mind. Anyway, the groups have already been drawn, a World Cup with many more teams than in the past, so no truly difficult group. Spain's group includes Uruguay, Saudi Arabia, and Cape Verde. Argentina's group includes Algeria, Austria, and Jordan. Mexico's group includes South Africa, Korea, and the winner of Denmark versus North Macedonia. My goodness, North Macedonia. What a World Cup, dear God.
The Spain group, except for Uruguay, looks like the money laundering group. Yeah.
Within Latin America, Uruguay is also a tax haven. Be careful, because there's also a significant amount of money from Argentina being laundered there, in Uruguayan banks, as well as from other countries. Well, last topic before we take questions. Today, this official document of the United States National Security Strategy, signed by President Donald Trump. This document basically sets the strategic guidelines of US geopolitics. It's the first document published under Donald Trump's presidency, with some very important changes, at least in wording. Juan Antonio, could you recap what's written here, the changes, and so on?
Recapitular lo escrito aquí, los cambios y demás. Vamos a ver, el documento se ha hecho público hoy, o al menos yo ya.
Let's see. The document was made public today, or at least I've already been able to download it. It's a lengthy document. I've almost skimmed through it. There isn't yet a translation that we could consider rigorous. And indeed, there are changes, important changes, and we need to explain a bit why those changes are happening. We'll discuss the changes in a moment, but I think it's worth, very briefly, taking a bird's eye view of the situation, the global situation. The global situation, bearing in mind that there's a very important focus, which is the issue of China, remains present in the new national security doctrine, as it couldn't be otherwise, because obviously China is the great emerging power that challenges American hegemony. Therefore, it makes sense that it's included in the strategy in the new document. But of course, for the United States to focus on competition with China, it has to close other fronts and secure a strategic rear guard, because China has one, all of Asia, including its so-called enemy, India. That's just how it is. So what do we have? We have that the United States wants to withdraw from the European conflict. To withdraw from the European conflict, it has to start negotiations with Russia. And for those negotiations to reach any conclusion, they must begin from a reality that Russia has defeated not Ukraine, but NATO. Or rather, I would say the expanded NATO, the Ramstein Group. 50 countries, 50 countries.
50 países.
And since they've been defeated, the United States, which is also part of the conflict, thinks, all right, before this turns into a catastrophe, we need to negotiate with the Russians. To negotiate with the Russians, they have to force Kiev to negotiate. So what do? Well, to force Kiev to negotiate, all the corruption that everyone has always known about suddenly comes to light. That is to say, of course, I understand, and we'll reflect on this later, how the major media outlets have been consciously lying to the public all this time about the corrupt and criminal nature of the Kiev regime. So, to put pressure on that regime, all the corruption comes to light. The problem is that starting with the corruption in Kiev, which some American experts, economists, and others have already mentioned, it's estimated at around $50 billion. Let me repeat that figure, because I want it to be clear that Zelensky can't possibly have those $50 billion stashed under a mattress. Of course not. So, this means that the corruption networks established in Kiev must have branches that extend elsewhere. And where would they extend to?
Que se extiendan por otros sitios. ¿Y por dónde se van a extender? Pues por donde vuelve a haber inspecciones.
Well, inspections, arrests, and other actions related to corruption are happening again. Where? In the European Commission. In which sector of the European Commission? In which area? In the European Diplomacy Department, led by Ms. Kaja Kallas, previously by Mr. Borrell, whose advisor, his right-hand man at the time, has been arrested, and his predecessor, Federica Mogherini, has also been arrested. And this, obviously, is a warning so that no one obstructs what the United States is doing. It's that simple. What is NATO doing? NATO, in its state of delirium, hysteria, and desperation, is busy threatening Russia with a preemptive strike. Putin has already responded. We won't spend more time on this. but that's roughly the situation.
Pero este es un poco el panorama. Entonces, claro, este panorama al final, todo esto que...
So, of course, this whole picture, everything that happens in closed-door meetings in Moscow or Miami or Kiev or wherever, ultimately has to take shape somewhere. These guidelines have to be official within the U.S. administration. Why? Because the guidelines of the national security strategy must guide what the State Department does, what the Defense Department does, and even what the Treasury Department does, because everything has to be paid for. So it's very important. And in that sense, the document comes out today. As I said, I haven't yet had a chance to take a look at it or analyze it, but there are some things that have come up that I think are worth discussing.
Que yo creo que merece comentar, ¿no? Es decir, uno.
That is, first, the main interest of the United States is to eliminate, to put an end to the military actions in Ukraine. In other words, some people should already start thinking about where they're going to flee, and not just from Kiev. The United States is considering restoring strategic stability with Russia. What does this mean, strategic stability? It means that in Europe there must be, as in the times of the Helsinki Act, a stable, strategic situation. Therefore, there must be security conditions both for the Europe of the European Union, so to speak, and for Russia. And this will mean that NATO will have to give ground.
Y esto va a significar que la OTAN va a tener que ceder. Esto es una de las principales prioridades que pone la estrategia.
This is one of the main priorities set out in the National Security Strategy, and it says that NATO must stop being seen as an alliance in constant expansion. In other words, it's over. Neither Ukraine will join NATO, nor Moldova will join NATO, nor Georgia will join NATO. That's it. It's over. In fact, the best thing they can do is start dissolving it. Better to pack up, sell the furniture at a flea market, turn off the lights, seal the door so the cockroaches and rats don't get out, and that's it. It's closed. Because it's clear that it's a danger that, moreover, no longer holds any military interest for the United States. Europe does have commercial interests, control interests, and even if you push it, might have a strategic foothold there, but no military interest, because it's already been shown that Europe won't go. NATO without the United States is nothing. It's incapable. We're seeing it right now. Since the United States stopped supplying weapons to Ukraine, it's been a disaster. There's no capacity. The national strategy says that Europe must take responsibility for its own defense. In other words, that Europeans should spend their own money. Or, put another way, the United States wants to stop paying 70% of NATO. Maybe it'll keep paying 40% or 30% or 50%, I don't know. But clearly I think what it's saying is, I'm going to save money there, and that savings will be paid for by the Europeans. And that's how all this rearmament business starts to make a bit more sense. Moreover, it specifies that the U.S. administration is in conflict with European officials, many of whom trample on democratic norms. This is already a stronger warning. Censorship, persecution, and the totalitarian path that Brussels is leading us down. And obviously, that's not the way things should go, and not because Trump wants democracy to be respected in Europe, but because one of the consequences of not respecting democracy in Europe is that they want to fine X hundreds of millions of dollars for not censoring. This already affects an American company, because it doesn't censor, because what they want is to censor, repress, imprison, persecute. That's Brussels, that's the European Union. That's why I've often said it's not reformable. Besides being corrupt, it's all of this, and therefore it's not reformable. The National Security Strategy says it no longer sees the Middle East as a dominant factor in its foreign policy. Well, I think what they simply mean is that with the situation now calmed, as long as it doesn't spiral out of control, thanks to Netanyahu's government, then a status quo could be maintained, since there's currently no risk, with Syria having cut off the axis of resistance, of a direct attack from Lebanon, or Anyway, I think that, and since there's business there too, business that interests the Saudis, the Qataris, the Emiratis, the Israelis, the board of directors of the American real estate companies, run by Trump, Wyckoff, and Kastner, meets, they make their deals, and even the Middle East has to remain pacified.
Y hasta Medio Oriente tiene que mantenerse pacificado. Repito que efectivamente sigue considerando que
I repeat that, indeed, they still consider China to be a battlefield. Well, China, the Indo-Pacific, a geopolitical battlefield. And that trade with China should only involve non-strategic goods. And here we are with the unresolved dispute over chips and rare earths. China has the rare earths. The United States is envious of the advanced chips. And of course, if China cuts supply, there are no chips.
Si China corta, no hay chips. And
if the United States wants rare earths, well then, let it hand over chips. That's how it is. But these are strategic goods, and the national security strategy doesn't want trade in that area. The United States is threatening to withdraw from several NATO defense coordination programs, NATO projects. It has also recently threatened to withdraw troops from Eastern Europe. And beyond that, I think it should be emphasized more strongly because this clearly reappears in the national security strategy in a very prominent way: the return to the Monroe Doctrine of hemispheric control.
Del control del hemisferio. Para Estados Unidos, el hemisferio es las Américas.
For the United States, the hemisphere means the Americas, North America, Central America, and South America. It states, in exact words, that after years of neglect, the United States will reaffirm and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore U.S. preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. It is stated explicitly. Therefore, it is a document that goes against the sovereignty of the countries of the Americas, in which the goal is to push Russia and China out and keep Europe from entering. In other words, to make everything, so to speak, a strategic rear guard.
Que todo sea, es decir, como retaguardia estratégica. Esto, a ver, no es raro porque esto ya alguna vez lo hemos.
This, well, isn't strange, because we've already mentioned it before in some of our analyses, that one of the options the United States had in the face of the coming multipolar world, without falling into the Thucydides trap, which would mean a war, and a global war means a nuclear war, was to say, all right, since I can no longer prevent the rise of a multipolar world, what do? Well, simply position myself strongly in the new world. That is, with my sphere of influence, my strategic rear, my sources of raw materials, and so on. And that means dominating the Americas, to which we must add Greenland. Let's not forget that.
Y a lo cual hay que unir Groenlandia, no se nos olvide. Es decir, Groenlandia está siendo comprada ahora mismo, creo que tenía por aquí algún.
That is to say, Greenland is being bought right now. I think I had some data about that around here. If you'll allow me, yes, I did have some data about it. Greenland is currently being bought by investment funds. Specifically, Ronald Lauder, who is the heir to Estee Lauder and one of Trump's donors in the elections, was the one who suggested the idea of starting to buy. And indeed, through a Delaware-based company, Greenland Development Partners, they are buying shares in Greenlandic companies to export spring water and develop hydroelectric projects and so on. It's a process that unfortunately we had already anticipated as well.
Por desgracia ya lo habíamos anticipado también, es decir, que Estados Unidos le ha puesto el ojo a Groenlandia y se va.
That is to say, the United States has set its sights on Greenland and is going to take Greenland. We don't know when it will take Greenland. No one should expect the brave Europeans led by Denmark to defend it. Please, let's not make jokes. We've already had enough with FIFA. So that's the situation. And this, of course, means aligning its friends in the region, in South America, to control immigration, stop drug trafficking, ensure security, and expand throughout the region by cultivating new partners. All right? Everyone can interpret that however they wish. So that's roughly what I've had time to analyze from a document that came out just today.
Muchas gracias, Juan Antonio. Acá una pregunta.
Yes. Thank you very much, Juan Antonio. There's an interesting question here regarding this topic, precisely. And I want to remind everyone that the three of us not only predicted Donald Trump's electoral victory at the time, but we also presented as one of the strategic lines of his future foreign policy before the Trump administration even began, the hardening of the United States' stance toward the entire American continent, from Greenland to Argentina, all the way to Tierra del Fuego. And that is what we are witnessing now. And that is exactly what this publication documents. And in that context, the question, and we're starting to take questions, from Sam Gallo, thank you very much. Do you think they want to establish a dictatorship throughout Latin America? Rephrased a bit, in the past, that iron control of the United States over the continent appeared through military governments commanded from the School of the Americas, or at least indoctrinated there. Could we witness a return to that dynamic? Or are we going to witness it?
I honestly don't think so. Why? Because at this point in the story, it just doesn't look good anymore. Military coups, old-style dictatorships, that doesn't seem plausible. Secondly, because it's always dangerous. I mean, in the Americas, there's also a tradition of nationalist and even revolutionary military officers. You never know how that might turn out. I mean, Hugo Chavez was a lieutenant colonel, lieutenant colonel, and he tried to stage a coup. So be careful with those things. Juan Velasco Alvarado, General Perón, be careful with those things. So that's dangerous. You bring in the military and they might decide they have other options. That's always dangerous. And as I said, besides, a dictatorship is always temporary. In fact, that's how it was established in Roman law itself.
De hecho, así se establece en el propio derecho romano. Es decir, en Roma, cuando se establece una dictadura, es porque el Senado...
In Rome, when a dictatorship was established, it was because the Senate, faced with an emergency or exceptional situation, decided that there should be a single command, the dictator. So, well, I don't see that happening right now. It's much easier in the world of postmodernity, social media, communications, and so on, to have a millie. It's easier to have a milai than to rely on an army to carry out a coup d'etat, which could turn out in who knows what way. Besides, there could be indiscriminate repression, there could be problems, well, you know, with human rights, disappearances, things like that we've already seen in the past, and that doesn't look good. It even provokes a reaction within American public opinion itself. So I think it won't be a dictatorship. It'll be something much more cynical and hypocritical than a dictatorship.
Bastante más cínico e hipócrita que una dictadura.
Yes, I agree. That's what liberal democracies are for. They're very liberal and not very democratic. I mean, you can manipulate electoral processes more or less as you please and keep changing presidents in different countries depending on, well, how much they've burned out during their term. So, apparently different, but it's the same thing, more of the same, and that's it.
And besides, Fernando, if someone acts up, instead of using generals with their tanks, you use the judges.
Yes, it's clear. The United States has plenty of instruments of domination that make it unnecessary to resort to military coups and the like. But just because they don't have an old-style military dictatorship doesn't mean U.S. domination will be any softer. That is, assuming they manage to carry this out, it's clear. This will be seen as a Plan B, as Juan Antonio pointed out. The United States, in principle, refuses to lose its global hegemony, and that's why it's clearly betting against China. To do that, it has to withdraw from Europe, reconcile with Putin, that's very important, we've talked about it here too, and notice that in every meeting between Russians and Americans, in every statement, in the 28 points, in Alaska, everywhere, one topic always comes up, the relaunching of economic relations between the United States and Russia.
Las relaciones económicas entre Estados Unidos y Rusia, porque es que Estados Unidos necesita Rusia.
Because the United States needs Russia, in the sense that it's going to need, well, it already needs Russian rare earths. Let's not forget that Russia is one of the 4 or 5 main producers or holders of global reserves, First come the Chinese, far ahead, then the Vietnamese, Australians, Brazilians, and Russians. They're all there, right? Then it's essential, aside from the whole issue of gas and oil, which is key, because the US is going to run out of fracking gas and oil quickly. And they know it's going to run out, that in the next decade, they won't be able to keep exploiting it. That's why they want to take over Venezuela, among other things. That is to say, and then, in that plan B, where they're pressuring some and others, and whose ultimate or main goal is to defeat the Chinese, that is, to prevent China from becoming, by its own merits and in a non-military way, but still from becoming the world's hegemonic power because it's gaining more and more economic and technological weight, etc. Well, plan B, as Juan Antonio pointed out, is to keep the American continent for ourselves, just like that. I mean, look, the first thing Trump does as soon as he arrives already tells us where things are headed. No, come on, I'm going to buy Greenland. Let's see, Canada, the 51st state, Panama, the Panama Canal. What's this thing the Chinese have here? We have to kick them out. And from there, he hasn't stopped. So it's perfectly clear that this is plan B.
Yes. In fact, for years now, US intervention has appeared, above all else, represented through the media. As time has passed, and major media outlets have lost ground to new media to social networks, well, we've simply witnessed a change in form, but they still lead that process. And institutionally speaking, they basically participate through the judicial branches, the so-called lawfare, judicial warfare. And when they exceptionally decide that they must carry out an old-fashioned coup d'etat, it's mainly the police forces that take part, as in the case of Bolivia. Do you remember the coup against Evo Morales? It wasn't mainly carried out by the army, but by the police, who had undergone far less of a democratization process than the armed forces had since the 1980s. Because they appeared as something, yes, less media-driven, less strong, less visible. However, all police forces receive their training, or at least many of the police leaders do in the United States. They respond directly, and even ideologically, to the United States, and they lack the institutional control mechanisms that the armed forces have. So be careful with that too. Remember, even in Venezuela, there were clashes between the police forces of opposition-led municipalities and the armed forces loyal to the government, right? So, well, an interesting fact. Well, next question. And by the way, I wanted to show here as a little break something very, very amusing. This here. Do you remember the movie? Let's see. You remember the movie 300, right?
This model, because it's a model that has nothing to do with what actually happened, but oh well.
Fernando, do you remember the actor's name? Ah, Gerard Butler. Here I am with the, well, a demolisher. For the second time, Jesus Gil did a free interpretation of this. Mass 300, but the 300 of Demolishing Myths. Pay attention to this, Demolishing Myths number 300. And several of these covers, some really very good. Pay attention to this other one, here with Juan Antonio, like a Roman warrior or something. Thank you very much.
Greeks, they were Greeks.
Sorry, Greeks, right, Greeks, because this, I've never seen the movie. The Battle of Sparta?
No, the Battle of Thermopylae, where the Persians look like, well, trolls. No, even worse. I mean, it's completely absurd. Indeed, the Battle of Thermopylae, just to leave it there, the Spartans took all the glory, but there were 5,000 Greeks fighting there, of whom 300 were Spartans.
Anyway, there was more, come on. The historical myths that later moved nations. That's their importance.
Next question. This one has been discussed at some point. I don't remember if it was with Juan Antonio or with Fernando. The question is from Alfredo Bertasel. Why doesn't Putin take advantage of Venezuela to deploy his missiles, as the United States has done for the last 80 years, blackmailing Russia with its eastward expansion?
A ver, complicado porque, como señalábamos antes.
Fernando Moragón first. Let's see, it's complicated because, as we mentioned before, you're getting into the backyard of the United States, and on top of that, they're applying the Monroe Doctrine 2.0. So you really have to think carefully about the kind of weaponry you provide. One thing is selling arms, as they actually do to Venezuela. I mean, sure, if you bring in an S-400, then we're talking about something entirely different. Why? Because that leads to a huge conflict. Well, so yes, there is, let's see. And in Russia's case, let's not forget that Russia already has its own issues. Enough with the war in Ukraine and with helping some other, let's say, countries like Iran. So, well, in China, as far as I know, and this is being seriously debated too within the Communist Party, meaning at high levels, they're considering changing their policy. In other words, China's foreign policy, since the time of Deng Xiaoping, has been one in which, in order to achieve economic development, it must maintain a very low profile in international affairs, of course not getting involved in any wars and so on. The Chinese have strictly adhered to this up to now, but in the face of constant U.S. aggressions of all kinds, they are basically reconsidering that it is no longer enough to provide diplomatic and economic support, or to sell certain types of weapons to their allies. That in the face of a serious act of aggression, such as one against Iran, for example, that is, in the face of a strong U.S. attack, China must take a step further and get involved. This is being debated. I'm not saying it will happen, but this is part of the discussion. They are no longer just a global power. They have an army that increasingly matches the American one, and what they cannot do is let their allies fall. This is, on the other hand, quite a normal thing. That is, they can't just let Iran go down the drain and allow that axis, which is essential for controlling Eurasia, but especially Asia, Russia, China, Iran, to be destroyed. In other words, they're somehow rethinking those positions of not, let's say, putting up with so many provocations and interferences from the Anglo-Saxons. So, let's see, but let's not forget that, for example, China has many economic interests in Venezuela. And the Chinese know perfectly well that one of the things Trump wants to do, and he says it quite clearly, is to kick the Chinese out, not just from Venezuela, but from all of the Americas, right? So they're rethinking this and saying, well, let's see. It's a bit like in Japan, isn't it? What we've seen these past few days with the Japanese Prime Minister taking up, well, making bellicose statements and in practice carrying out joint exercises with the Filipinos and so on. And well, the Chinese have said, this is as far as we go. Don't come telling me that in the event the Chinese invade Taiwan, because it's always the Chinese who invade Taiwan, the Chinese have never made any statement or carried out any operation suggesting they want to invade Taiwan. But anyway, what does it matter? We just make it up and that's it. Well, in the event that happened, since Taiwan would affect Japan's national security, then somehow there would have to be intervention and help for the Taiwanese. Of course, given Japan's history with China, this has, let's say, sparked an internal upheaval among the Chinese leadership. On top of that, to make matters worse, finishing off the job with the whole thing about no. And on top of that, we're going to do yet another revision of the Constitution, a reinterpretation of the Constitution. Because, well, something that would be great is if there could be nuclear weapons in Japan. American ones, obviously. I mean, of course, then they say, look, there are Chinese, Russians, and they slip in the other one and say, but where do you think you're going? In other words, calm down. because this is serious business. So, China is increasingly reconsidering that it has no choice but to intervene in many parts of the world, since its interests are at stake and it can't afford to let its allies fall.
In Alfredo's question, there are two things. First, that Russia has never tolerated this. That is, when after World War II, all of Eastern Europe fell under Russian, or rather Soviet influence. Finland was neutral, Austria was neutral, and when the Americans got the idea to place those missiles in Turkey, that's when the missile crisis began. What happened happened, and the Yankees had to withdraw the missiles from Turkey. The agreement was, I'll pull out of Cuba, I'll remove my missiles from Cuba, but you'll withdraw the missiles from Turkey, and they had to withdraw them. What was the problem? The problem was the disastrous interval of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 10 ominous years of Yeltsin, which NATO took advantage of to expand.
Que aprovechó la OTAN para expandirse. Pero en el momento en que Rusia vuelve a
But at the moment when Russia begins to rebuild its potential, we see that in Georgia, it did not allow the Caucasus to be taken prisoner. It did not allow the issue of Ukraine, whose intention was to bring Ukraine into NATO and therefore be able to place offensive missiles in Ukraine. We'd be talking about 5 minutes to Moscow. That broke the strategic balance and is one of the reasons for the special military operation in Ukraine. I understand that, since the Western press has a crackpot explanation, that Putin has a bad night, wakes up and decides to invade Ukraine, or maybe he was listening to Wagner, I don't know. Well, of course, nothing makes sense. This is one of the reasons.
And expanding on what he says, we have to take Putin seriously. His famous recent statements, saying, look, let me make this clear. I have no intention, I've said it 200 times already, of invading Europe or anything like that. Now then, if you want, look, I don't want to do anything, but if you want to go to war, well, fine, we'll go. What can you do? And second, look, Ukraine, this isn't a war. This is a surgical war. He even makes a gesture, as if he were dissecting something. This is a surgical war that wouldn't be a war, let's say, in the modern sense, since we're not going all in and we're using a lot of velvet gloves. With Europe, that wouldn't be the case.
The meeting, Fernando, the meeting is the one that was negotiated, the one Wyckoff attended, and the U.S. delegation really looked like the board of a real estate company. I mean, of course, they're all real estate developers. All of them. Yes, yes. So, well, one of the things that was discussed in separate documents, because we found out that the famous 28-point plan was one of the 4 documents they presented. That is, they presented 4 documents. And one of the things that has been under discussion is the issue of the European Collective Security Treaty, which Russia had already requested in December 2021, which has resurfaced. And in a way, the United States gets involved in the matter because it knows this is a casus belli. That's why, in the recently published National Security Strategy, the issue of restoring strategic stability with Russia appears. And strategic stability with Russia means that there should be no offensive weapons in the Baltics, Finland, Poland, Romania, or Bulgaria. But look, Juan Antonio, it's just that. Let me finish. That's the issue, right? That is to say, well, taking advantage of the situation in Venezuela to install missiles there wouldn't be appropriate right now. Why? Because it would undermine the course the U.S. administration has taken to restore the strategic balance in Europe. That's not in Russia's best interest. And if Venezuela needs to be helped, there are other ways to do it that don't involve placing S-300 missiles there. And we must remember that these are nuclear missiles. That is, you can put a nuclear warhead on them, or a warhead filled with candy for children, but a missile is still a nuclear missile. In other words, the enemy will never know whether the warhead it carries is a nuclear bomb or not.
¿Es una bomba nuclear o no lo es?
Before that step, Juan Antonio, Russia, just like China, although they may consciously decide otherwise, could establish military bases, indoctrinate Venezuelan troops, set up a ship.
To tell him, of course, yes, all that, yes. Satellite assistance, those things can be done.
Exactly. But look, it's clear I haven't had the chance to read it yet, not even to take a quick look at this U.S. national security document, this national security strategy. But what little I've seen is the Reuters report, and what Reuters says, what it's more or less reporting, Juan Antonio, just a heads up, is that according to them, the United States has told its NATO allies that by 2027 they either take responsibility for Europe or the U.S. will withdraw from almost all NATO-related organizations. There's one thing Juan Antonio said that's clear, and this is going to happen. That is, a strategic balance in Europe with a security system that covers all of Europe inevitably means the end of NATO. It's over. In other words, complete disappearance. Finito.
Desaparición completa. Finito.
We must remember that Russia is part of Europe. Of course, you can't think about peace in Europe. Peace in Europe. I mean, what are we talking about? Which Europe are we talking about? There won't be a situation of strategic stability on the continent unless all actors are guaranteed that security. Because otherwise what happens is an imbalance, and therefore some actor gains a strategic advantage. And that cannot be tolerated by Russia or by any other actor.
Well, just to point something out, nothing more. Let's see, for example, Russia has been a regular and consistent supplier of military equipment to Venezuela for decades now. I mean, it's been selling weapons to them since the beginning of Hugo Chávez's presidency. So in that sense, it's always been there.
Yes, all of that is true. For me, sometimes both Russia and China lack the imperial will that characterizes the United States, even compared to decadent empires like England. And unfortunately, the United States responds to only one language, the language of force and threat. Sometimes the Russians and the Chinese don't fully remember that. They want a world that's much better than the one that actually exists.
They are more civilized in the good sense of the word. And also keep in mind that China, Russia, and Iran are all land powers. The projection of force across seas and so on isn't something that really fits into their mindset. In fact, China once had the largest fleet in the world. And what did it do? Fernando will know. It sold it.
Yes, no, let's see. Or the famous voyages of Admiral Zheng He in the 15th century when the emperor changes. I'm not interested in this anymore. Come on, the ships are nothing. Of course, this is very important.
The Chinese are the inventors of gunpowder, and with gunpowder they made fireworks instead of rifles. That is the...
Of course, it's the very conception of a tellerocracy, of a land-based power that seeks to advance imperially, but to settle. And by settling, it assimilates peoples, religions. In other words, it keeps expanding. Even China built a wall to remain there, enclosed within the Middle Kingdom. That is, China and the heavens. In other words,
it's something that I think is very hard to grasp. But look, Juan Antonio, the pressure from the United States against the Chinese is actually forcing them to become a maritime power from a military standpoint, like the Soviet fleet. Of course, and in fact, after all the pomp, so to speak, of the debut, that is, putting the third aircraft carrier into operation, we've known for some time that the fourth one, which is basically finished, will be nuclear powered.
That is to say, they're being forced. To wrap up this topic, it's fine to think that one can count on the help of their allies, China, Russia, who are distant allies of the Americas, of course, which is logistically a problem. But that's not the solution. The solution is in the hands of the Americans. The solution is for the peoples of the Americas to decide to be sovereign, and that's it. And the bases leave. And look, we establish headquarters with whoever we want. And if one day we have to face off, then we face off. But really, we can't keep, I don't know. Resigned to the idea that this has to be this way and hoping that with a bit of luck, the Chinese, Hezbollah, the Iranians will come and help us. That can't be. This is the same criticism as the Europeans, you know?
Sí, sí. Es el legado, lamentablemente es el legado del colonialismo.
Yes. Unfortunately, it's the legacy of colonialism, the perception of oneself as a colony. We, the Americans, the Latin Americans, always carry the idea of submission to the great powers of the world, which, naturally, countries must establish relations with the great powers, but above all, they must build their own strength, their own autonomy, their own sovereignty, and for that, unity represents the necessary path within the framework of Latin America. Sometimes, unfortunately, we forget this.
A veces, lamentablemente, esto no lo recordamos, pero a propósito de estos cambios...
But, speaking of these changes regarding the BRICS, by the way, this from Hator Trinidad, more and more our channel has contributors from Brazil and Portugal. The languages, Portuguese and Spanish, are quite similar. Many Portuguese speakers understand Spanish. That's why many Brazilian and Portuguese brothers and sisters join us. Greetings to all of them. The question: could the BRICS powers threaten Biden's empire? At some point, will the BRICS create less flexible institutions, both financially and militarily, as a counterpart to the declining NATO, International Monetary Fund, World Bank, and so on?
Let's see, yes. But in the long term, this is being built, and quite a lot is already being done. It's a very complex relationship because here we have powers that are each completely different from one another and have diverse interests. For example, take the case of Saudi Arabia. On one hand, it's interested in having excellent relations with the Chinese and is willing for the Chinese, who are its main oil buyers, to pay in yuan. But at the same time, it has to maintain an excellent relationship with the Americans because it has many dependencies. In other words, the petrodollar is fundamental. So here we have to reconcile a lot of very diverse interests and move forward, let's say, as best we can. Quite a bit has been achieved with the creation of the BRICS Bank this year. The fact that they are promoting, and this is becoming increasingly real, trade in the member countries' own currencies is gaining ground. Now, even at this moment, let's imagine they had the ability to say, well, let's launch a devastating economic attack against the Americans. Let's start selling, for example, US debt. That would be a disaster for everyone, including the BRICS. In other words, there is still a great deal of dependence on the dollar, on trade in dollars, for all kinds of payments. This has to go through a process. And I think the BRICS, or whatever comes out of the BRICS, could become a different organization, much more structured. Well, they're on the right track, as is the case with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I think one of the key elements we'll probably remember over the years is what happened at the Summit of Heads of State and Government of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization this year. In September, when China takes a step forward and says, no, this is chaos, not in those words because they're more diplomatic, but basically, we need to build global governance. This idea that there are empires here, that some do whatever they want, and that there's a rules-based world order, no. We need to build global governance, because we have global problems. And someone steps forward and drafts a document that the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, along with other guests and so on, signs. It's a statement of intent, obviously. But it's already a way of getting involved, saying, well, we're willing to lead in the best sense and to make ourselves available for a different world order, one based on respect for national sovereignty, and so on. That is to say, not this chaos that the Saxons and their vassals have plunged us into. I mean, I do think it can move forward, but this isn't something that happens overnight. We'll have to see the geopolitical and military relations of the American empire.
It's a process. It's a process. And as a process, we can't measure it in terms of the immediate politics of governments, the term of a president or a prime minister. It's a process with a broader scope. Of course, it's a process with a strategic vision. And since it has a strategic vision, look, ever since the BRICS began, it's been a 20 or 25-year process. There are milestones, right? 2035, 2045. Now, what I'm addressing is the logic of the process. That is, how is it happening and why? Then you realize that there's a whole series of multipolar organizations being created. BRICS is one of them. And it's important because it touches the economy, and also because within it are China, India, Russia, and Brazil, and other emerging countries have been joining. Vietnam, for example, which seems like it never gets mentioned. We remember Vietnam because there was a war there 50 years ago, but no Vietnam. Watch out for Vietnam. So in the end, these multipolar organizations overlap. We've talked about this before, they overlap. Many of the countries that are part of the BRICS are also in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, or in the Eurasian Economic Union, or in ASEAN. In other words, there's overlap. The logic of the process first requires a whole series of trade agreements, industrial development, the establishment of trade routes, distribution chains, the Silk Roads, the North-South corridors, the Northern Maritime Route, and so on. As those routes take shape, necessarily, for the defense of those routes, they will have to reach agreements on security and defense issues, of course. And those security and defense agreements, which are military alliances, will necessarily involve technological collaboration to standardize all those security and defense systems. So one thing will inevitably lead to another. As for the economic issue, which is the one that needs to be opened up the most, this process must be carried out very carefully. Why? Because almost all countries hold a lot of U.S. Treasury debt. Since the United States is the most indebted country in the world, with more than $38 trillion of debt, well, where is a large part of that debt? Well, the thing is that countries hold their reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds because they're more or less safe. They're not going to invest in Treasury bonds from just any country, say a South American or African one, because those don't offer the same security and probably not even the same interest rate or ease of trading, selling, and so on. So basically, you can't just get rid of the dollar overnight. You can't suddenly create a different reserve currency. Why? Because you'd be hurting the Central Bank of China, the Central Bank of India, everyone, really. The only one that's somewhat spared, not by choice but because it's been forced to, is Russia, which has very low debt and practically no U.S. Treasury reserves.
But of course, countries along those lines, countries that are major commercial powers like China, the thing is, China is still paid in dollars in international markets. That means it has to do something with those dollars. It's not going to burn them like incense. And one of the things it used to do, or has done, though it doesn't anymore, was buy U.S. debt, because you have to invest those dollars in something. In other words, let's not forget that we're still in a world system dominated by the dollar, even if less and less so.
China has done this in a very significant way. For example, with many countries with which it establishes trade or infrastructure development relations, it is telling them to switch their debt from dollars to yuan. Of course, that's terrible, because it's another piece of the de-dollarization process. It's not something that happens overnight. It's a constant, gradual process. And if you look at the dollar reserves in central banks and observe the curve over the past 20 years, you'll see it's going down. There isn't even a peak at any point. It's a steady decline. What else has been done? The cross-border interbank payment system, the well-known SIPS. In other words, it can process transactions and serves as an alternative to the Western SWIFT system. It can operate in multiple currencies, not necessarily in dollars or yuan, but in several currencies, and it also connects banks from dozens of countries. It already handles a growing volume, not yet at the level of the dollar, but it's only a matter of time, little by little. The digital yuan. What is the digital yuan for? It's a digital currency backed by the Central Bank of China, not a private cryptocurrency. What's its advantage? Well, it allows instant, traceable transfers without the need for traditional banking intermediaries, which are usually Western, and that other countries can use. For example, Brazil, Russia, and African nations are already using it. All of this, of course, has its own internal logic and will tend to grow. The thing is, since we're used to the fast-paced politics of the coyote and the roadrunner, and we think everything has to be done within one legislative term, we don't realize that this started years ago, quite a few years ago, and that it will continue to be watched for many years to come. In other words, and obviously, some of us will count ourselves lucky if we manage to see the first rays of dawn in the end, right?
Yes, let's also remember the BRICS Bank, the Development Bank. If I recall correctly, that's what they called it. Although it still doesn't have much international presence, it's already active.
It's already established.
Alright, next question. As a separator, this time we can use here more of Kisuski's covers. Take a look at this one. Here with Juan Antonio. None with Fernando in front. Fernando, artificial intelligence is discriminating against you. All of this was made with artificial intelligence.
It's just that I've always been the type to watch the rear. Yeah. Yeah. And besides, you're really ugly. Sure. I mean, there was also I don't remember what he said. There's a famous phrase, well, I don't know who said it, but it goes, better that they say that.
He fled there, and there he died.
That's where he died. Yes, indeed. Well, hey, next question. By the way, more than 3,000 demolishers connected and 2,000 likes. We're missing 1,000. Please help us out, demolishers, with a thumbs up. This is Pesci from Argentina, Pesci77. Thank you very much for the support. Hello, United States. In your plan presented today, it apparently mentions that the Middle East is no longer a zone of strategic interest. How credible is that? Could you say in which region of the world you see a new armed conflict as most likely? Regards. Thank you.
Good question. It's not that they're saying it's no longer a zone of geostrategic interest, but rather that they're saying something like the Middle East is no longer a dominant factor in their foreign policy. This is due to the belief that with the Gaza Plan agreements and the Abraham Accords, the region is more or less stable. Well, it's an unstable balance, but more or less. Why? Because, of course, the big concern everyone in the West had, and here there's a method to the State of Israel, was that strengthening the axis of resistance would lead directly to confrontation. Since it has been, well, appeased, and I say that very much in quotation marks, they consider the situation to be under control. But every day we know what's happening in Gaza, the West Bank, and southern Lebanon. Anyway, let's take Trump at his word that things have calmed down, right? With the fall of the Syrian regime, the axis of resistance is cut off, although the supply chains for weapons from Iran to Lebanon are already being re-established. But all of this takes time. Everyone needs time now to rebuild their lines. First of all, Israel needs time. So it's impossible that in the near future, in the short term, the Middle East won't remain the main point of friction. That doesn't mean it's stable, as they claim, but it does mean it will continue to be the main point of friction. Which regions of the world might see an armed conflict?
¿Qué regiones del mundo son las que pueden ver un conflicto armado? Fundamentalmente allí donde hay fractura geopolítica.
Fundamentally, wherever there is a geopolitical fracture, we've always said it. The Rimland, that is the entire area stretching from northern Scandinavia, the Baltic Sea, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean, the South China Sea, the Sea of Japan because of the Koreas, and up to the Arctic. That area has always been one of geopolitical fractures. Conflicts can arise there. Also, where emerging powers clash with the dominant power, Africa. And above all, where the United States, the hegemonic power, wants to preserve its strategic rear guard, that is its backyard, as it has always called it, its Monroe Doctrine, meaning South America. Now, conflicts that could have a global impact would mainly be in the Rimland, perhaps the Asia-Pacific. It could be with Japan, as Fernando rightly mentioned earlier. It could be that at some point Israel loses its head again and tries to attack Iran. Or it could be that the crazy Europeans stir something up in the Baltic. All of that is possible. All of that is possible because we're not dealing with normal people, and many times they're not rational actors. All of that is possible, but it's also possible that a geopolitical fracture could occur in one of these places, such as in Africa or in the Americas, for different reasons.
Fernando, para vos precisamente la segunda respecto a esto.
Fernando, for you specifically, the second question regarding this. According to this supposed US strategic plan, the United States will abandon Europe and will have to respond to European security. And, considering the bravado of European leaders, at least the European governments would soon want a direct confrontation with Russia, in addition to constantly hammering on the need to continue the war in Ukraine. So, how possible do you think a war between Europe and Russia without the United States is, dear Fernando? Thanks to Paco J for the question.
Let's see, it all depends. I mean, let's not forget that even though the Trump administration is now acting as a mediator, as a neutral party, everyone knows that the United States, and also Trump himself at the time, during his first term, has been has been the main actor in triggering the conflict, and especially the Democrats. A change in the administration in the next presidential elections, if the Democrats come in, who are more hawkish, or even hardline Republicans like Liesel, Rajan, and company, then obviously they could reignite the confrontation with Russia. That said, as Juan Antonio was saying, there are a lot of crazy people out there, so they could mess things up. In principle, the Europeans are absolutely clear about two things. Another thing is that they don't say it and instead tell us a different story. But for example, right now, I can't remember his name, the Prime Minister of Belgium, with the pressure von der Leyen and company are putting on him, you have to hand over the Russians money. And he says, no, what are you talking about? You'll sink us. But it's not just that they'd sink us economically, which would be something unprecedented, a disaster. It's that one of the things he says is, well, let's see, I got carried away with nonsense. The Europeans know it perfectly well, Mrs. von der Leyen, the Baltics, Mrs. Kallas, that the war is lost. It's lost. It's lost. And they know it. Another thing is that they have to put on other shows. That is to say, they know it. Stop with the nonsense and fairy tales, says the Belgian Prime Minister. Let's see, that war is lost. Now then, there are many vested interests, because as Juan Antonio pointed out, let's not forget that here, as is logical and as is usually the case, geopolitical, geostrategic, military issues and corruption all get mixed together. And when we were talking, or when Juan Antonio was talking, about the whole corruption scandal going on right now in Ukraine, with that anti-corruption agency created, sponsored, and run by the United States. I mean, this isn't, there's an agency that's been a pain in the neck for years, and suddenly, boom, it jumps on this. This is prearranged. It's been set up. Well, the Americans are involved, huh? Yes, absolutely. So then, well, this comes out, and as you more or less pointed out earlier, of course, in this corruption scheme, it's not just the Ukrainians. The Europeans are also mainly involved, taking their cut in their envelopes and making a lot of money from it. That is to say, the web of corruption in the European Union is tremendous, and these people have taken millions. In fact, just think about how much they've taken. So much that there isn't even a proper accounting of what's been handed out. No, nothing. To the point that, depending on who tells you, you get a different number. But since that's known, of course, there are many vested interests that could trigger, in Europe's case, a war on the part of the Europeans. But they're very aware that if they go to war with the Russians, they'll lose. And right now, come on, just before the show I saw that among all the nonsense we're coming up with now, or with which we're going to bring back or re-establish mandatory military service, there are already protests in Germany from young people, and they've barely even started. I mean, who's going to go fight against Russia? I mean, Europe's comfortable youth, university students, and for what? What do you tell them to make them risk their lives there? I mean, they know they have no future. So, well, in this madness that is Europe and in this chaos, irrational decisions are indeed being made. And there are certain hotheads, like the Baltics, for example, or the Nordics, who right now, well, are starting to believe their own lies. Well, and of course there's an interest that's clear, a very obvious interest, no doubt, from the British to carry out their age-old policy, which is to prevent there from being one or two continental powers in Europe, and in this case mainly Russia, that could in some way stabilize the continent and so on and rival the United Kingdom. And it's the British who are carrying out the largest number of operations of all kinds. They're involved in other things behind the Ukrainian attacks on ships. That's the shadow, meaning, well, they're there provoking. How far are they willing to go? Well, that's very hard to assess.
But of course, there's always a level of uncertainty. I mean, we don't have a crystal ball. We don't know what might happen. When an analysis is done, we always try to start from the idea that we're dealing with rational actors. In Europe, that's doubtful. Thinking that the people in the European Commission, Ursula, her crew, the Baltics, the Poles, and the Nordics, are rational actors? Well, not so much. But let's assume they are rational actors. What has been demonstrated right now is that Russia's industrial capacity is greater than NATO's. I understand that when we talk about Europe and Russia without the United States, we're talking about NATO countries without the United States. That is to say, it's already been proven to be superior to all of them. So in order to try to create a military force capable of facing Russia, they would have to change many things and invest a huge amount of money that doesn't exist. A huge amount of money that doesn't exist. Because one of the problems they have, and that's why they want to seize the frozen Russian funds, is that there isn't a single penny to send anywhere. Because there isn't a damn penny. A damn penny, you know, for Spaniards used to be 5 pesetas, not a damn euro to send. When it comes to the production of ammunition and weapons systems for an industrial conventional war, Russia surpasses them all. So it doesn't make much sense. What's more, since the projects established in 2023 for the production of drones and artillery ammunition, they haven't fulfilled a single one. They haven't been able to meet any of them. I mean, it's really pathetic, isn't it? That everyone says, no, there can't be. I mean, objectively, no general staff would ever think of organizing a war against Russia. But let's imagine something else. Let's imagine that they actually managed to revive the entire defense industry, that they managed to convince millions of young Europeans, without really knowing why, that we're all going to war, that they managed to do all that, to set up wonderful logistical lines so that in 24 hours, hundreds of thousands of troops can be moved east. We need to have many ports, many Bordeaux, and many rivers. But let's suppose that were the case. When Russia saw an aggression from 29 countries launching against it, the Russian nuclear doctrine would be set in motion. What would that be good for? It would serve the purpose Putin mentioned the other day. If that happens, I'll have no one to negotiate with, because no one will be left, That's the issue. So it's absurd. Rationally, there isn't going to be a war. The point is to avoid the militarization of Europe, an enormous and senseless defense expenditure, and an increase in social control. All that may indeed happen, but an open war against the world's greatest nuclear power, that's madness. Rationally, no one is going to go for that. No one is going to go for that. Now, it's true, as Fernando said, that there are actors who are not rational, and actors who have historically acted in very dirty ways, covert operations, provoking divisions and conflicts. And of course, those things can happen. That's where the work of statesmen comes in, to make sure that never, ever escalates into another world war in Europe, given the consequences we already know from the previous two, right?
Speaking of young people, Hillary Clinton talked about them here yesterday.
More than 50% of young
Attention. Some of them don't represent what they think they're showing. And that's where they get their information, where they learned about what happened on October 7th, what took place in the days, weeks, and months that followed. There are many young American Jews who don't know the history and don't understand it. Well, this YouTuber went off on her.
Thinks the youths are too stupid to realize.
Well, I'm not presenting it because of copyright issues, rights, and all that. Anyway, the stupid young people. She, of course, a beacon, a light of wisdom, the owl of Minerva, at a conference organized by the pro-Israel lobby, where you could hear things. This is child's play compared to what was said at that conference. Well, teenagers or young people are stupid, and that's why they reject the Israeli genocide against the Gazans. That's Hillary Clinton's view.
Very briefly, let's see. Luckily, Hillary Clinton's time has passed. I mean, she lost the election to Trump and is now nothing more than an old psychopath on the payroll of the Jewish lobby, etc. And with, let's see how I can say this without causing trouble, with implications in certain cases involving a man named Stein. And the Clinton couple already has plenty to deal with because of that. That is to say, fortunately, this lady now has, let's say, relatively little influence. Right now, she's still asleep from the defeat. Yes, no, she's a psychopath. This lady is crazy, you see? This lady, we were lucky. And as I said, Trump, well, we can see what Trump is, but this lady would have taken us into a world war without any problem, given how much she's into war. No, of course, well, this lady is...
But come on, this is something for a psychiatrist. All of these people are victims of a kind of messianic fundamentalism. The ones who say, well, if the Armageddon has to come for the Messiah to arrive, then let it come. So, of course, with that mindset, which isn't very different in its degree of madness from what the Islamic State or any of those Salafists might have, they're on some level, or maybe worse. Obviously, you can expect anything from them. These are the dangerous ones, and these are the ones who can truly lead the world to disaster. because they don't act under a rational framework. That is, when we talk about war, we have to talk about the general staffs. General staffs plan their military operations, their campaigns, in a very rational way. They look at resources, possibilities, demographic potential, the morale of the population. Hundreds of variables have to be taken into account, and based on that, decisions can be made. But this gives the impression that that they're all just a bunch of fanatics, right? Americans, that is. Absolutely deranged characters who might say that if nuclear Armageddon comes, it's merely a prelude to the second coming of the Messiah. So, of course, when we're dealing with people like that, what we need are psychiatrists, not soldiers.
Speaking of psychiatrists, here's a very relevant question for the NATO leader, the NATO Secretary General. Pay attention to the question and to Mark Rutte's answer.
Also known around there as, well, no, better yet, let's imagine the negotiations break down. Both sides keep fighting, and the United States stops supplying weapons to Ukraine, even paying for them.
Do you have a plan B for this? Thank you.
Well, I do not. No, I don't think.
Do you have a plan B for this? No, I don't think that's the plan B we need to be thinking about, because the United States is very consistent in its support for Ukraine, just as all NATO allies are very consistent. Of course, what the United States told us is that it wants to provide Ukraine with the necessary weapons, both lethal and non-lethal, but it expects Europeans and Canadians to step up when it comes to paying for them.
Plan B. The problem here isn't that they don't have a plan B, but that they never had a plan A. That's the problem.
Once again, we return to the topic of rational actors. A general staff engaged in a military campaign, whatever it may be, must always have a plan B, even a plan C. You must always have a way to get out of the conflict. That is, you're not going to be in an eternal war. It's impossible to be in an eternal war. Therefore, you must have an exit plan for the conflict, and you must always have a plan B. One of the major flaws in all European policy regarding the conflict in Ukraine is that there was never a plan B, never an exit plan for the conflict. Never. They thought, in their arrogance, that with sanctions and this and that, they would deliver a strategic defeat to Russia. Of course, everything falls apart for them when that doesn't happen. And when that doesn't happen, what do they have? Nothing. And that's how we've reached today's point, where they have nothing. So, of course, they're asked what plan B is. There is no plan B. There is no plan B. And they still keep saying that, well, the United States is going to provide the weapons and that will pay for them. Yes, we'll pay for them. Not even that. Not even that. And even more so after reading the national security strategy, that it's in the United States' interest for this to end. And if it has to end by stopping arms sales and withdrawing support, it will do so. In fact, it's already doing it. Because the last military shipments that the U.S. administration had to carry out, which had already been previously decided, have been halted. In other words, that process is already gradually taking place, to the point that those alleged statements from Macron and Merkel have come out, telling Zelensky to be careful because an American betrayal could occur. Because, of course, for Europeans, this is a betrayal. That is to say, there is no plan B. They never had a plan B. And they told us that, well, of course, we have to start from one basic point. We have to start with one thing, something that has been haunting us for 3.5 years. The West has made 3 mistakes here. 3 tremendous mistakes. The first, you can't lie to everyone all the time. And these people have been lying to us since February 22nd, 2022, when the military operation began. They've been lying, and of course the political class, the financial class, and the media class have been lying shamelessly. And it's not that they were mistaken or didn't have all the information. No, 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 no. Because if there were channels that were providing other kinds of information with far fewer resources than they had, then they knew it too. They necessarily knew it. Therefore, they were consciously lying, knowing they were lying. They've been lying to us for 3.5 years. Let's recall, just to mention the most ridiculous things. For example, Putin's 2 cancers, and that he also had Parkinson's. The coup the oligarchs were supposedly going to stage. The washing machine chips, the offensives with shovels, the transport by donkey, an army of drunks who were incapable of anything. That Ukraine was winning. How many times have we said over these 3.5 years that it was victory after victory until the final defeat? Well, that's exactly what we've been witnessing. From victory to victory until the final defeat, which is already happening. And why is that? Because they've lied to us. And the most surprising thing is that they're the same ones who lied to us about the climate emergency, about the pandemic, about the causes of the 2008 crisis. They've always lied to us. And I repeat, what's surprising is that we still think the same people who've been lying to us for years and years and years will suddenly tell us the truth tomorrow morning. No, they'll keep lying to us. They'll adapt the narrative, find a way to twist it, to try to maintain their story, their discourse, to keep deceiving us.
No,
but the thing is, But the thing is, there's an additional problem. And it's not just that they lie. It's what you were pointing out. In the end, an army, a general staff, basically does what the political leadership of the country orders it to do. That is, if I send you to fulfill some reasonable objectives, they give you a plan. But the problem is that these people have ordered things based on their own irrational beliefs. So of course, it's impossible for any army to carry them out. That is, they believe their own lies. Of course, the fact is that they themselves were convinced, because they had made a terrible assessment of the Russian economy, that no, look, we'll impose sanctions, it'll collapse, people will take to the streets, there'll be uprisings, a color revolution, Putin will fall, we'll break up Russia, and we'll have it all. The thing is, they actually believed that narrative. I mean, that's why when they see it's not true, and even the IMF now admits, saying, well, okay, yes, we were a bit wrong. It turns out Russia is the 4th largest economy in the world, ahead of Germany. What were they thinking? What image did they have of Russia? The problem, I'm afraid, is that they've bought into the anti-Russian, supremacist, European, especially Western European ideology. I'm exaggerating, but that thing von der Leyen said about washing machines, about how they get chips from washing machines, and that Russia was just a gas station. What kind of objective analysis have these people done of Russia's capabilities, economic, military, and so on? None.
No, the crazy ones. None. But there were people who knew. Of course they knew, of course. We didn't know, Fernando, they knew too. Sure, look, the second mistake they make is thinking that everyone is going to lose their memory and that everyone will always stay afraid. And that's also a huge mistake. Because sure, in the end, memory is fragile, but there comes a point when, after hearing so many stupidities and lies repeated, you start remembering all of them. And then you start by making jokes, laughing about it, and then you start getting angry. And there comes a moment when, as they keep pushing you and pushing you, the fear starts to fade away. And this is another mistake they've made. Now, they may have populations that no longer believe anything, and on top of that are losing their fear. And the third mistake they've made is thinking they're untouchable and that actions have no consequences. Of course, that's true until someone decides you're not untouchable anymore, right? Zelensky or Yermak. And that actions do have consequences. Everyone needs to be extremely careful, because if one day things change, especially if they change abruptly, everyone here will pay the price. It must be said that many of us have a long memory and no fear at all.
Muchos tenemos memoria y no tenemos ningún miedo. Ningún miedo.
No fear. It's just that one of the fears European leaders have is that they know that we have a comrade here.
Mira, Fernando, aquí tenemos un compañero que ya por 2 veces
who has already twice officially demanded a breakdown of the billions that Spain has given to Ukraine. Of course, the government still hasn't provided it. Obviously, that's because it still can get away with it. But maybe the day will come when it can't anymore. And maybe someone will have to answer for whether that's legal or not. And maybe someone will end up in a dungeon or breaking rocks. The sad thing here is that they're in the Monegros region because we don't have a Siberia to send them to.
No, but look at one thing. You praise yourself.
Impunity cannot be the norm. These guys have played their game here.
In the West, betrayal is part of the culture. That is, as we're seeing, the United States changes its interests for whatever reasons. And that's what we've been saying from the start. Let's see, how is this going to end? Well, there are things we can't know. But that it will end with the United States abandoning the Ukrainians and the Europeans is obvious, because they've always done that. Then, when the United States, in this case Trump, says, I'm no longer interested in people like Yermak or Zelensky, heads start to roll. And in Zelensky's case, I'm one of those who think his head will roll, literally. In other words, he's got less of a future than a herring at a school gate.
Yes, Trump has said it. You can still find a country to move to, with your family, with your parents. You know that their parents are in the state of Israel. You can go live there. If they're telling you, they're telling you. Mrs. Callas, they're warning you. They're searching the offices. They're telling you. Of course, they've always counted on impunity here, from the highest to the lowest. Even that theater director who decided to censor Russian culture, Russian plays, music, or dance. What do they think? That son of the great harlot of Babylon won't pay, won't suffer the consequences? If karma is bad, it's very bad. And fear changes sides.
Here we have images of what Fernando just mentioned. This is from today. Demonstrations here in Berlin by young people against the mandatory military service currently under discussion, although already partially established. For now, it's voluntary, and in that way they generate the necessary number, determined by them, of soldiers for the armed forces. But naturally, they want the armed forces, the strongest army in Europe, to grow. Therefore, they won't generate a sufficient number. So they want to impose it sooner or later. In Germany, there are people against this. The good thing is that although there are still very few people, this is the first demonstration of this kind with young participants.
Manifestación de estas características con gente joven, ¿sí? Porque hasta ahora las manifestaciones en contra de la guerra, o bien...
Because until now, the demonstrations against the war were either by the old pacifists from the 1970s, with their signs, the little dove, and the olive branch in their mouths, if I remember correctly, or by parties of the so-called new far right. In general, well, some from Sarah Wagenknecht. But among ordinary people, outside of those groups, there has been very little participation so far. Perhaps the underlying issue in the discussions between Juan Antonio and Fernando about Europe and its leaders is that it affects them directly, of course. But they can do all that because of the absence of a democracy in which people, affected by the possibility of war, can take part in the decision about their life or death in a war. And since they don't participate, all this madness can happen because of the lack of a real democracy. That said, here's the last little piece of video and topic of conversation with you. The very last one.
Conversación con ustedes, esto lo último ya. Acá Maduro de hace 2 días sobre la conversación.
Here, Maduro, from 2 days ago, about the conversation with Donald Trump. I had a call and spoke with the President of the United States, Donald Trump. I can say that the conversation was conducted in a respectful tone. I can even say it was cordial between the President of the United States and the President of Venezuela. I'll say more. If that call means steps are being taken toward a respectful dialogue, from state to state, from country to country. Welcome dialogue, welcome diplomacy, because we will always seek peace. Welcome to Europe, welcome diplomats, welcome the pits. The ending in English sounds unintelligible. Word, never, never in the like.
Never in the like.
In the like. Bueno.
Well, Maduro speaking in English is always amusing, understandable.
Mr. President, don't use English if it's not necessary.
Yes, Marco Rubio speaks Spanish very well, no problem.
Esta llamada generó sorpresa.
This call caused surprise. It's possible that in these back and forths, yes, no, Donald Trump's strategic disorientation might at some point lead to a step back from the current stance of attacking fishermen, or barges that apparently belong to fishermen, drug traffickers, or someone else, without any proof, without committing an even greater madness or a strike aimed at toppling Maduro.
Un golpe para el descabezamiento de Maduro. ¿Podría retroceder Trump en esto?
Could Trump back down on this? Yes, he could back down. I mean, careful, this could cause problems for Trump. Attacking boats without presenting a single damn piece of evidence about whether they're carrying cocaine or bananas, whether the people on board are, well, drug traffickers. No, they'd be low-level workers for the traffickers. Whether they're low-level workers or fishermen. In fact, there are already lawsuits filed by relatives of some of these people because they are fishermen, and there have been more than 80 deaths. The other day, there was an incident in which one of these boats was attacked. 2 people survived, clinging to pieces of wood in the ocean, and what they did was finish them off.
En el océano, y lo que hicieron fue matarlos. Esto es un crimen de...
This is a crime, well, it's a murder. And who gave the order? The admiral on duty, who commands the forces there. It was Peter Hess, from the Department of Defense. Who gave the order? Well, from the Department of War now. Who gave him the order? This, could end up causing Donald Trump a problem. I don't know if he realizes it in his sense of justice, but can you imagine the Democrats' campaign when the selection of military officers approaches, if this keeps up? And it starts to look, indeed, like some of these people who were killed have nothing to do with drug trafficking. Moreover, even if they were involved, because we're talking about a police force, listen, why don't they arrest them instead of bombing them? If they have the Caribbean full of ships with helicopters and everything, why don't they arrest them? That way they could show everyone, look, these are the traffickers, and this is the drug we've seized. But they don't do any of that. Of course. Why? Because the strategy, I believe, is one of tension. To create a kind of psychological war, to strain the country, to carry out acts of sabotage, power outages, and so on, to frighten the population. And indeed, of course, this keeps escalating. If the other side doesn't give in, what are you going to do? Then it happens. The escalation toward the extremes begins. What Maduro does is mobilize more military groups, train them for guerrilla warfare in the jungle. So you increase the pressure, Maduro responds, more Russians and Chinese arrive. You increase the pressure, he sends more ships from Maduro. And of course, there comes a moment when, who stops? And who's going to back down? Obviously, since the one acting aggressively is the United States, it's the Trump administration that has to back down. And they'd better do it, and do it skillfully. Because if they make a mistake there, 9 months before the midterm election campaign, and with lawsuits in the United States itself over killings, they could find themselves in trouble. I mean, this happens to Trump because he left things in Marco Rubio's hands. If he had left them in my cat's hands, things would be safer. You've just left it to a guy whose family already has a record for drug trafficking, who has his quirks, his dependence on the Cuban-American voter, on Venezuelan exiles living in Miami. And when you have all those ties, you end up making blunders. And Marco Rubio isn't very smart. He's not very smart, and Trump, look, they've taken him out of the middle of the negotiations over the Ukraine issue. And well, then there's the excuse about the cartel of the Suns and all that. I mean, of course, people don't go around investigating these things, nor should they. They talk about the cartel of the Suns. The cartel of the Suns has a journalistic origin. It appeared in the early 1990s, during the time of Carlos Andrés Pérez. And what the cartel of the Suns was about is that there were corrupt police officers and military personnel who were paid by drug traffickers to let them pass, not because they were producing anything themselves. I mean, where is coca produced in Venezuela? Somewhere. Let's see, what are they talking to me about? So, well, this thing that started back then, later on, when the Bolivarian Revolution came, obviously, no matter how much the new institutions tried to correct some of these issues, it's very difficult, and there are still people who can be bribed to look the other way, whatever it may be. And that's it. Neither Maduro is the head of the cartel of the Suns, nor are all those ridiculous claims coming out of the White House to justify an imperialist aggression against a Hispanic country. Period. And anyone who refuses to say it is complicit with the gringo, is sold out to the gringo, is a traitor to that thing some on the right insist on bringing up about Hispanic identity. Well, if you care so much about Hispanic identity, you can never under any circumstances, no matter who governs, support a gringo aggression against a Hispanic country. That's crystal clear. And anyone who doesn't take that stance is revealing what they really are. I'm saying this mainly about the Spanish right, but also about some of the actors in South America who are currently supporting the gringos in this operation.
Milei, no more and no less. Not just that.
But look, there's another thing. Right now, Trump is in serious trouble. Because of course you've deployed the entire fleet. You've made a huge mess. You've taken out about 20 boats, but now you can't justify the mess you've made by saying, no, I've taken out about 20 boats, as they're saying, and we've already put an end to drug trafficking. No, no, no.
No, but Fernando, do you know how you can justify it? Well, in the end, by saying that he made a great deal with Maduro, that Maduro is a very funny guy, that he likes him a lot, that he's a brilliant guy, that he made a great deal, that American oil companies will be able to work there, that it's going to be very beneficial for the United States, and that's it. He moves on from the topic. Yeah, but for that, you have to, that which objectively is a victory for Maduro.
Of course, that's perfectly clear. But look, there we already have, like I said, the element that always trips up the United States and makes them lose wars left and right. They miscalculate. And they say, no, well, we can keep pressuring Maduro. You mentioned a strategy of tension, sabotage, covert operations, whatever. Let's try to split Venezuelan society in two, and so on. Some nutcase, even though there are some, might even think of a Libya-style scenario. Yes, yes, yes. Of course, that's the problem, right, with the United States. That is, they make bad assessments.
What's happening, Fernando, is that they've already lost the element of surprise. No, of course, of course. At this point, no matter how foolish the Venezuelan government might be, I'm sure they've already set up a replacement for the entire chain of command, and probably even a second replacement for the entire chain of command. So that if they launch a surgical strike and manage to eliminate, like they tried in Iran, I don't know, Maduro, Diego Cabello, Jorge Rodriguez. I mean, I'm sure they already have substitutes ready, so that within less than 24 hours, there's a second line of command, and the chain of command remains intact. Why? Because, come on, it's been, what, 3 months already with this? The element of surprise is already gone. Yes, of course. I mean, what do they think? That the Venezuelan general staff doesn't know there could be a Tomahawk missile attack and so on and so on? What do they think? That Maduro is going to be sitting in his office at the Miraflores Palace? Come on, what is this? What kind of nonsense is this? What kind of Hollywood movie is this? Of course not. And even if U.S. intelligence knew where they were and launched a missile and took out, say, the number 2, there would be a replacement number 2. Already decided. It would already be decided. So I think that by losing the element of surprise, they don't have many options left. They really don't have many options left.
Fernando, Juan Antonio,
it's truly a pleasure and a privilege to have this conversation with you today. Once again, my personal thanks to both of you for joining us on this journey here in talk number 300. Already 300 talks on demolishing myths.
What years are they? Are they 2 years?
A year and a half. Yes, 2 years. 2 years since the talks, more or less. 2 years. Of course, it's not just the two of you participating, but also other guests. Still, the only ones here with weekly talks are you two. So about 80% of the talks are between us. Well, in December, we'll wrap up the year. Next year, we'll start with lots of new things, including your shows here on Demoliendo Mitos. We're also launching an English language channel that's growing, reactivating the TikTok account. Help us out there too. So, well, this is our work to raise critical awareness, the fight against windmills. I'm deeply grateful to you, and of course to our audience as well, to all our demolishers. More than 3,100 at our best moment today, so a huge thank you to everyone. On Sunday, our usual talk with Fernando. Today, obviously, he won't be doing his show on DMP, we're wrapping up the broadcasts here. And to Beatriz Pulido as well, greetings to our moderator. Fernando, my friend.
A Beatriz Pulido también un saludo a nuestra moderadora. Fernando, querido.
No, como se suele decir en estas grandes ocasiones.
No, as people usually say on these big occasions, now that we've reached 300, we're already preparing what will be the celebration of 600. Another 300, that is, we're already getting started. It's like the falas. Once they've burned, work on the next ones begins right away.
And if they censor us, like I already told you, Fernando, to the Pyrenees, and on shortwave, we'll start broadcasting again.
Demolishers, see you soon. Bye-bye.
See you later.
¿Qué?